All right, everyone. So thank you so much and welcome back to another installment of the UQ Philosophy Seminar. And today I have the pleasure of having Karen Green from the University of Melbourne. She's an honorary professor there. And she will be kind enough to be talking to us about some objects of thoughts are not objects. So Karen, please take it away.
Okay, so thanks very much for having me. Um, so this is a paper that's an offshoot of, I guess, a project that I've been running in some ways for a long time, which is defending Frege's semantics, though my interpretation of Frege's semantics is perhaps a little bit different from some people. I don't agree with attributing to him syntactic priority thesis that goes back to Dummett. So last year I completed a manuscript and sent it to Oxford, and it's fallen into a bad hole, a black hole. But it's basically running the line that Frege was brilliant, and everybody else failed to really understand him properly. So this is along those lines. So it started off. Whoops, how am I going? Okay, it started off as a pretty straight sort of Fregean response to neo-Meinongianism. But on the way, I did a bit of history, and it sort of morphed a little bit more into a comparison between Frege and Meinong. The comparison was partly sparked by this passage from Russell's review of Meinong's theory of complexes and assumptions. Okay, so Russell says there that the object of thought, even when this object does not exist, has a being which is in no way dependent on its being an object of thought. All these are theses which, though generally rejected, can nevertheless be supported by arguments which deserve at least a refutation. Except Frege, I know of no writer on the theory of knowledge who comes as near to this position as Meinong. So here you have Russell more or less identifying Meinong and Frege on being committed to objects of thought which don't exist but have being. And I think that some people will find that quite surprising, because I think that in general, one has tended to think of Frege as being anti-Meinongian. Frege doesn't accept that there are reference of non-referring singular terms. And there seem to be quite a lot of similarities between what Russell does on denoting and what Frege does. After all, they both use quantifiers. But it's also the case, when you think about it, that on denoting is as much a refutation of Meinong, or as much a refutation of Frege, as it is a refutation of Meinong. And when you look at what Russell says about Frege in the Principles of Mathematics, you see that what Russell has in mind when he says of Frege that he accepts that there are objects of thought which have being even when they don't exist, is that he has in mind Frege's concepts. Now, Russell himself doesn't directly criticize the theory of concepts on denoting, but in the Principles of Mathematics, he's more or less rejected that as a plausible distinction on grammatical grounds. He argues that the distinction between objects and concepts Frege's distinction between objects and concepts can't be accepted. In a way, his position is like Bruno Kerry's. He thinks that there isn't a fundamental distinction to be drawn between objects and concepts. And then in On Denoting, he, well, actually in the Principles of Mathematics, however, he does discuss Frege's distinction between sense and reference, which I like to call a distinction between sense and indication, which are actually the names that Russell first used. He says of Frege's distinction between sense and reference that it is almost the same as Russell's distinction between a denoting concept and what it denotes. And then that's what he says in Principles of Mathematics. And then when he gets to On Denoting, he just identifies sense and reference with a denoting concept and its denotation. And so you end up with a kind of Frege-Russell view that has been widely accepted and widely criticized. So what I want to do, what I'm going to do is, first of all, go back to Frege and his own semantics, in which the distinction between objects and concepts is central. So modern Meinongism sees itself as similar to Meinong in that it accepts that there are non-existent objects. So this is Crane's way of getting to the position, okay, some of the things we think about exist and some do not. That seems to be like a truism. So then you say, okay, we can think about non-existent objects. And then you get to, so one's committed to there being objects of which it's true that there are no such objects. Okay, so that seems very paradoxical. And what happens is then you have to say something like, well, actually, there are two different kinds of existence. Meinong had existence and Bastien, which we'll talk about a bit later. In Priest's case, what he does is he offers two different versions of the quantifier, one of which is, if you like, existentially committing, and the other you can quantify over all sorts of non-existent objects. And, you need to be able to quantify over non-existent objects if you want to talk about intensional states where, if you like, the object of a thought doesn't exist. And so we have a case for there being non-existent objects. Now, if you're a Fregean, where this has gone wrong is that you think that when we think about that something doesn't exist, you think that we're thinking about an object. But actually what Frege says, of course, is no. When we think about things that don't exist, we are attributing non-existence to a concept, or we're thinking about a concept and thinking of it, that it's not instantiated, that nothing falls under it. And so concepts are the objects of our thought when, as it were, we think about what doesn't exist. Actually, interestingly, although Priest takes Routley and Routley to be his inspiration, when you look at Routley's Exploring Meinong's Jungle, they don't actually talk about non-existent objects. They talk about non-existent items. And they also talk about second-order quantification. And of course, second-order quantification is quantification into predicate position. And as a Fregean would interpret that as quantification over concepts. And so this is if you like, another reason for thinking that there are similarities between what Frege's doing and what Meinong was doing. So what was Frege doing? So Frege's interest was in constructing a formal language in which proofs would always be reliable. You wouldn't be able to fall into fallacies as you easily can in natural language. I think the best way of thinking about this is what he wanted was a language in which syntax and semantic value align and don't come apart, unlike natural language in which syntax is a bad indicator of logical form. So at a very sort of basic kind of level, you could sort of think that, oh, okay, these four, my child slept, Rip Van Winkle slept, someone slept, and no one slept, they all look like subject predicate. But it's natural to think that, well, you can infer from my child slept, if I have a child, that someone slept. But if you think that the semantics of no one slept or Rip Van Winkle slept are the same as the semantics of my child slept, you're just going to get yourself into problems, because at least taken literally, Rip Van Winkle slept doesn't imply someone slept, and certainly no one slept doesn't imply someone slept. And so, you know, we all follow Frege and certainly distinguish the logical form of someone slept from the logical form of my child slept. And we use an existential quantifier and say, you know, there is something which slept, and we say for no one slept, it's not the case that there's someone who slept. Notice that following Quine, we don't read the someone slept and no one slept as involving talk of concepts. But if you're Frege, you would see these as saying something about the concept of having been asleep. So Frege's reading of the universal and existential quantifiers is somewhat different from the standard, if you like, Quinean version, or really, this goes back, I think, to Hilbert and sort of the origins of model theory, a standard reading. So so there are two things that are distinctive in Frege's logic. One is that he has a clear way of distinguishing the thought that X is true of everything, from the judgment that if the property of being X is true of everything. So the other thing is that the universal quantifier is, in a way, substitutional. At least he's using function and argument in his logic. And so he explains the universal quantifier as indicating the true for every argument. So for every argument, the value of the function, it the quantified expression indicates the true when, for every argument, the value of the function phi is the true, and it's the false otherwise. And he doesn't have a primitive existential quantifier. The existential quantifier is defined in terms of the universal quantifier. And the assertion is the assertion that it's not the case that every argument that's substituted in the functional expression x is not true or is false. So you can already see here in his logic how the judgment stroke divides what we would think of as the ordinary predication into two elements. There is the thought that is just expressed by this funny thing, by this universal quantification, and then there is the judgment that the thought indicates the true, or that the thought is true, which Frege says that every true sentence indicates the true or refers to the true. There's been a bad translation of Bedeuten as means, according to which what Frege says is that every true sentence means the true. And then that sort of seems to imply that every true sentence has the same meaning, and that seems completely ridiculous. So part of the reason why I like to talk about indication rather than reference or meaning is because I think that to say that every true sentence indicates the true is what all true sentences have in common. Well, they indicate the true, and as I'll spill out a bit later, I think you should take the true to be being or what is. So all true sentences have this in common: they indicate what is the case or the true. Nevertheless, Frege isn't out of the woods. He's shown how to formalize the judgment that no one slept, everything such that it's not, didn't sleep. But he hasn't dealt with Rip Van Winkle slept. Nor has he dealt with Rip Van Winkle doesn't exist. But he has the option of doing what he did in the other case, and that is to say, well, natural language is misleading in these cases. So what he officially says in the case of 2 is that Rip Van Winkle doesn't refer, it doesn't indicate a person, and so it's not the kind of singular term that we should allow in a formal language. But he can say something which is also plausible. We can read fx as when we can read the as saying this. So the horizontal in Frege is actually really the concept of being true. It's a function that takes the true, it takes a sentence to the true if the sentence is true, and it takes it to the false in every other case. So really this, the horizontal with fx can be read as it's being true that Rip Van Winkle slept. And in fiction, what we do is we say things like, imagine that it's true. Imagine the truth of the thought that Rip Van Winkle slept, which is what Frege says about fictions. Fictions involve thoughts, but we don't add the judgment stroke to those thoughts. We say, consider the thought, or which is what we do when we consider an assumption, or we say, imagine that things are thus and so, which is what we do in fiction. When we say imagine that, there are things that are, as it were, true in the fiction, but we go wrong if we then think that that's actual truth. More probably, so officially, Frege says, well, sentences that involve singular terms that fail to actually refer are neither true nor false. They're problematic, but we can explain what we're doing when we use them in fiction. But Rip Van Winkle doesn't exist is a bit more of a problem, because clearly that is true, genuinely true. And so what a Fregean has to do in that case, and quite a few people have gone down this path, is to say, actually, once again, here's a case where surface syntax is a bad guide to logical form. In these cases, Rip Van Winkle isn't any longer operating as a singular term. It's operating as a concept expression. And what we're saying is actually just that it's true of everything that it's not Rip Van Winkle. Okay, so those are sort of the standard ways in which Fregeans have got around what look like reference to non-existent objects, or talking about nothing, what seem to be sentences that that are talking about non-existent states of affairs. And indeed, if you've read Ayer and his attack on Heidegger and Sartre, you'll know that for quite a long time, the analytic tradition argued that all those continental philosophers who talk about nothing are just logically incompetent, and they should formalize their sentences, and then they'll see, we don't need to talk about nothing. We don't need to recognize nothing. We can get rid of what looks like reference to nothing by just standard formalizing with standard predicate logic. But I think actually things are not quite that easy, because in a sense, I think nothing comes back into Frege's semantics when he says that all false sentences indicate the false. Because what is the false apart from nothing by another name? Indeed, in the Grundgesetze, Frege identifies the false with the extension of the empty concept X is not self-identical, or the value range of that concept. And actually, the value range of the concept being not self-identical is what he identifies with, well, it's equinumerous anyway with zero. And so, what's zero but nothing? Aren't we back to naming a non-existent? So this is Frege's, well, a form of Frege's setting out of his own semantics in a letter that he sent to Husserl. And as you can see, it's a bit more complex, I think, than what people sort of fall into when talking about Frege, where they just concentrate on sense and reference, because you have at the top, you've got sentences, the syntactic division between singular terms, concept words, and sentences. And then you have, if you like, what you might call a cognitive level, where you've got the sense of the sentence, which is a thought, the sense of a singular term, and the sense of a concept word. And then at the level, which you might call ontological, what's referred to, you have the Bedeutung of the sentence, which are truth values, the Bedeutung of the singular terms, and the Bedeutungs of the concept expressions, which are functions, according to Frege. They are functions from objects to truth values. So the false, Frege says, is an object, okay, and it's the Bedeutung of false sentences. But that doesn't seem to have got rid of nothing, at least it doesn't to me. And so I prefer a reinterpretation of this Fregean semantics, according to which every true sentence indicates the true, which is the totality of what is or being, but the false sentences fail to indicate anything. So I think that's rather nice, because then, you know, the singular terms, when they fail of reference, they cause failure of reference in the sentences. And the concept expressions also, they fail of reference when they're vague, or when you don't have a determinate function from object to truth values. And so if a concept expression is not sufficiently precise and doesn't actually determine a precise function, then once again, sentences fail of reference. Failure of reference is inherited by the sentences in which the concept expressions occur. But notice that it's very important that the concepts that map all objects to the false are perfectly good, logically good concepts. They're not. So all of the empty concepts have the same Bedeutung. They all indicate the function that takes every object to the false, or never manages to indicate what is, but they do it in different ways. So concept words have senses, just as singular terms do, and the functions. So the empty concepts have a being, but they don't indicate anything that exists. Once you've reinterpreted Frege's idea that false sentences refer to the false, with the idea that false sentences fail to indicate anything, they fail to refer, you get a version of Frege which you can call a soft Parmenidean ontology. I'm using Parmenidean. So Mumford has a version of a response to Meinongianism, which is Parmenidean, and I'm interpreting Frege as a soft Parmenidean. That is to say, he believes that the true is primitive, So he says truth is primitive, and I want to say what he means by that is an ontic version of truth as being or what is primitive. Being false is a form of failure of reference. The Parmenideanism is soft because he doesn't deny that there is change. In fact, by introducing concepts and functions, you have a way of representing change. I mean, what we, in mathematics, what functions allow us to do is to give graphs which allow us to represent changes in nature. And you could think of the judgment stroke as indicating a change in the state of the person who begins by considering a thought and then maybe rejects it or judges it to be true. So change is real and can be represented using functional expressions and concepts of functions from objects to truth values. And I've kind of got there a few papers in which I've been developing some of these ideas. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, although this has started off as saying, look, you can be Phrygian, you don't have to think of thinking about what doesn't exist in terms of non-existent objects. You can think about it in terms of concepts that are not instantiated and thoughts that are not true and senses of singular terms which don't actually refer. But how does this relate to Meinong? And in some ways, you could say, well, actually, what Frege was doing was actually what Meinong was doing. He just did it in a rather better way. So Meinong makes he introduces the idea that there are ideal objects. Okay, ideal objects are objects which subsist but don't exist. And it turns out that really what he has in mind when he talks about ideal objects is relations. He's worried about that old problem of the reality of relations. And he says that diversity and similarity are relations amongst things which might hold between existence, but which are not themselves at all real or wirklich. And then he has other things which he says bestehen, subsist, and these amongst these are objectives or states of affairs. So Frege, of course, has the solution to the problem of the reality of relations, which is taken up by Russell. Okay, Frege and Russell say, oh, look, predicates and relational expressions are just basically the same. Relational expressions are just functions of more than one argument. Relations hold between objects, and both relations and singular concepts, which are only true of one object, they have a certain kind of being. They must have a certain kind of being since we can think of them, but sometimes they're not instantiated. So in effect, exists becomes instantiated, and then we accept that there are uninstantiated concepts and relations. And Meinong's objectives, which he thinks of as states of affairs, turn in Frege's logic into thoughts. Meinong also thinks that abstract objects like numbers subsist but don't exist. And I'll say something a little bit about that at the end, but Frege, so Meinong also has, as well as subsistence and existence, the case of objects that don't exist at all. The round square, for instance, and these, he says, have nicht sein. They are not. And he then distinguishes sein, existing, from so sein, being thus and so, in order to say that although the round square doesn't exist, the sentence, the round square is round, is true, because the so sein of the round square is being round. So you end up with there being these kinds of truths about non-existent objects. Now, in a sense, what Frege does is that he distinguishes instantiation, sein, from subordination of one concept to another. And he would say of the round square is round, is ill-formed, if you interpret it as having the logical form FA, but it's true if you read it as a case of the subordination of one concept to the other. The concept being round and square is subordinate to being round. And so although being round and square is an empty concept, it doesn't, you can say everything that's round and square is round. So there is a truth there, but it's a truth about the relations amongst concepts, not a truth about an object falling under a concept. Okay, so I think that this gives us a naturalized, this semantics can be nicely naturalized, and I'll go through this fairly quickly because I've been talking for nearly 40 minutes. So the tradition has particulars, universals, and states of affairs. Frege, unlike Meinong, has changed the subject in a way. He's changed the subject, so now he's talking about the meanings of words. And in thinking about the meanings of words, he's seen that the concept, that meaning is ambiguous, and he distinguishes the sense of an expression, what is expressed, from the reference, what is indicated. But at the ontological level, the distinction between particulars and universals is kind of a distinction between objects and properties, where properties can be thought of as causal powers. And so when you think about what Frege is doing, when he turns towards language, you can interpret him as trying to understand the properties of words, the properties of signs, the properties of sentences. One of the things I forgot to say about the Fregean semantics is that he's talking about sentences. His word Satz sometimes gets translated as proposition, and then that makes him sound like a Russellian. But he says quite clearly that what he means by Satz is a set of audible or written signs which has a meaning. So words are part of being, they are real, and words have properties, they have sense properties, and they have properties of indicating objects, functions, and truth values. And so there's nothing mysterious here. There's nothing genuinely abstract. And that then leads me to a kind of promissory note, which is that Frege's semantics offers a path to solving Benacerraf's problem. Both Platonism and nonaism are similarly problematic in relation to the fact that they give accounts of abstract objects and numbers such that these are non-existent objects which can't stand in causal relations with us. But Frege's concepts do stand, at least they're related to causal relations, because we come to grasp the meanings of simple first level concepts by being taught to sort objects into those that do and those do not fall under the concept in virtue of the properties that concepts, that the objects have. So Frege talks about the marks of the concept. The marks of the concept are those properties that an object must have in order for it to be true of the object that it falls under the concept. And so, you know, how do we learn to grasp concept expressions? How do we learn to grasp these functions from objects to truth values? Well, we learn to sort material objects into kinds in accordance with their properties. We can then combine, so the simple concepts, there's a sense in which we can only grasp them when they do exist, but then we can construct complex concepts by logical addition of simple concepts, and we get concepts that aren't necessarily instantiated. We can then have higher level concepts, number concepts, which are like quantifiers. They're second level concepts under which first level concepts fall. Collections of objects. And so Frege made the mistake. In Grunlagen, he was thinking really of numbers, of numerical statements anyway, as being like quantifiers. But then, because of the logic of surface mathematics, and because we talk about numbers as being equal, and he didn't think that identity could hold between concepts, it could only hold between objects, he introduced objects which are correlates of concepts, and that then led to paradox. But if we just stay with concepts, then I think we can give an account of arithmetical truth that is both naturalistic and is tied in with the causal world. So we don't have the Benacerraf problem. So that's my alternative to nonism on the basis of Fregean semantics.
Thank you so much, Karen. I have to stop the recording. Let me see.